Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the University of Richmond School of Law. It's great to have you here. We're particularly delighted to have a group of alums returning with us today. When we're done here, if you haven't been back for a while, I hope you'll walk around the school and walk around the campus and remind yourself of what a wonderful place this is. For our other guests and students, we're delighted to have you here as well. And delighted to welcome back Senator Tim Kaine back to the campus. Before we get started, I am required to note that the use of University of Richmond facilities for this event does not constitute an endorsement by the university. The views expressed during this event are those of the speaker and not the university. The University of Richmond does not endorse or oppose candidates for public office. Lawyers require me to say that. Most of you will be familiar with Senator Kaine's career, which started as a civil rights lawyer and includes public service as mayor of Richmond, governor of Virginia, before he was elected to the Senate in 2012. In fact, he's one of only 30 people in American history who served at all three levels. In the Senate, Senator Kaine serves on the Armed Services, Budget, Foreign Relations, and Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committees. He's ranking member of the Armed Services Readiness Subcommittee and the Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Near East, South Asia, Central Asia, and counterterrorism. Senator Kaine has a long-standing relationship with the university, for serving first as an adjunct professor of legal ethics in 1993, and later as distinguished lecturer at Richmond Law and at the Jepson School from 2010 to 2013. In 2012, the University of Richmond School of Law had the pleasure of awarding Senator Kaine and his wife, the Honorable Ann Holton, with our most distinguished award, the Green Award for Professional Excellence. We awarded it to them together, because together they have been remarkable public servants in their careers. When we conferred the honor, we noted that both of them were models of the pursuit of excellence, the criteria for the Green Award. But they'd done that in the service of justice, and we were enormously proud of that. We're most grateful for your service. Today, Senator Kaine will be speaking on the topic, the Constitution at 230, Signs of Stress and Resilience. Please join me in welcoming Senator Tim Kaine.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm really glad to be here with you. This is great. Hey, thanks so much. Thank you. I am thrilled to be here to have a chance to talk a little bit about the Constitution at 2:30, but really to then take your questions and suggestions. I want to thank Wendy for her kind words, and I consider her a good friend and a great leader of this law school. Dr. Crutcher, it's so good to have you here as the president of this wonderful university. Noah, my friend who asked me to come out today, and I have a lot of friends in the room. And Wendy talked a little bit about my history with the law school and with the University of Richmond. So taught legal ethics from 87 to 93. A lot of little kids that I taught are now like Attorney General of Virginia. It makes me feel very old. I was a leader in residence at the Jepson School when I was mayor in 1998, and then came back and taught here at the law school in Jepson from 2010 to 2013. But maybe my most intense memory of the University of Richmond is this moot courtroom. I won a trial in 1998 that was the largest civil rights jury verdict in the history of the United States, $100 million jury verdict against Nationwide Insurance Company for redlining minority neighborhoods all across the United States. 2 weekends before the trial, we rented your moot court on the Saturday, and we had jury pools that we were filming, and we tried a one-day version of the trial and watched the jury's reaction to various witnesses and our opening statements and our closing, and then learned from it. And what we learned that day in this room helped us win a historic case that ended up changing the way homeowners insurance is written in the United States. So I have very, very fond memories of UR, and every time I turn into the parking lot here, I feel real good to be back with friends. I'm going to tell you a story, and I'm an upbeat and optimistic person, and I'm upbeat and optimistic in what I'm going to tell you today, because I think the Constitution is living, thriving, and working. But I'm not going to be hesitant either to point out challenges that I see, including challenges with the branch I serve in, the Article I branch. But let me start with just a story that, it's a personal story that then gets me into my topic. So I was on a national ticket. I was the first working Virginia politician to be on a national ticket since 1840. And despite Virginians supporting us, it didn't work out. So I got back, and I was pretty disappointed coming back to the Senate the week after election last November. My wife and I decided we would take a 3-day weekend, then I would take no vacation. I'd just go right back. And I didn't take a vacation until July of 2017. I just thought that would be the better thing to do. I got back to my office, and I had a letter on my desk that an 8-year-old named Penelope had written me from Charlottesville. And the letter said, "Dear Senator Kaine, I'm really sorry you're not vice president, but senator's still important. Can you help stop my classmates from being deported?" So I was like, wow. And then she said, I've done a drawing to give you some encouragement. So out of the envelope, this Sharpie drawing flutters out, and she has drawn a picture of me. She's actually a pretty good artist. Now she did make me younger and thinner and more hair, but she had gotten little details like senators usually wear little lapel pins. Well, she'd drawn a little lapel pin on with her Sharpie, and she put a cape on. I was wearing a suit. She put a cape on with a T on it, and she wrote over the top, "Be the hero." And so I framed that and I put it on my mantle, but it was kind of interesting. Be the hero. Help stop my classmates from being deported. And I was like, wow, this is what an 8-year-old's got to worry about now. I've had so many interactions in the last year with people who are disappointed, but there's a subset of the disappointed who are more than disappointed. They're really afraid. I was walking through the basement of the Senate a couple months after the election, and there's a guy who works there who's Salvadoran American, and I'm fluent in Spanish, so we usually chat in Spanish. And I said, it was really early, it was like 7:30, and I just said, "Ki, what's up?" And he goes, "I'll tell you what's up. I've been here in this country for 25 years, and I've worked in the Senate for 20 years, and people look at me and my kids like we're criminals now." I meet women, especially young women, who are afraid, and their fears usually get expressed something like this: am I likely going to lose out in jobs to a less qualified man? Am I likely to experience sexual harassment where I work? How come you guys keep whittling down women's health care options and there's never any controversy about men's health care options? I meet young people who are afraid. No, you do a lot of environmental work. I meet young people who say, we have leaders of the country now who don't even accept climate science. What's the planet going to be like for me, when I am an adult? I meet parents who are afraid. They tell me, I have a disabled kid. Are you really going to take the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid away when we depend upon this so our child can have a wheelchair and then be able to go to school and have an IEP that's partially funded by Medicaid? And I have colleagues who are afraid, Democrats and Republicans. We're grappling with, and we'll have a hearing later today in this area on war authorization questions. We're grappling with fears that if we have leaders that demean the prospects of diplomacy, doesn't that raise the risk of unnecessary war? So I'm having a lot of conversations with people who are afraid. That's how I get into my topic, because the framers who worked on the Constitution in Philadelphia, and it was finalized 230 years ago, September 17th, they were afraid of some things. As we grapple with our fears, it's interesting to look at what they were grappling with and how they decided to deal with theirs. First thing they were afraid of is after the glorious win in the Revolution, the government had kind of been a bust. So the Revolution's over, 1781, 82. They're gathering in 1787. The first 4 or 5 years were really tough. You had 13 states, but you had no executive. You had no real national government. There was a Congress, but there was not really much of a national government. George Washington wasn't the first president of the United States. There were at least 8 presidents before George Washington, but they were not executive presidents. It was the president of the Congress in Confederation of the United States of America. And so they were having all kinds of problems. States were engaging in trade wars with each other. A big one was they had promised all these Revolutionary War soldiers, now we're going to give you a really good pension when you're done. And then who was there to give them a pension? The states weren't going to give them pensions, and there wasn't really a federal government. And there was a rebellion in Massachusetts, Shays' Rebellion, by these veterans who never got paid. They came home thinking they'd get a pension. Not only did they not get a pension, they were getting sued for debts that they incurred when they were fighting and winning the revolution. So they were afraid that this glorious experiment was pretty much running out of gas, and there was going to be a big problem. And that's why they got together in Philly to write a new constitution. And they decided we have to have a national government. But that scared them too. Creating a national government, and they knew they needed to create an executive, a national executive, a true president, that really scared them. Because what they knew in 1787, they knew what executives do. They knew kings, they knew monarchs, they knew emperors, they knew sultans, they knew popes. They knew executives overreach and abuse power. Go back and read Henry V, about why wars get started. I mean, they were students of executive power. They understood very well what executives would do. And so they're going to create an executive, but they knew there was a tendency toward despotism, a tendency toward overreach in any executive. And so they were afraid of that. And so what did they do to deal with their fears? Well, they set up this structure. Now, I will say, they were afraid of some other things too. It wasn't just the fear of an executive that would become a despot or an overreacher. They were worried about a federal government tromping on states, and they were worried about government generally tromping on individuals. That's why they added the Bill of Rights a little bit later. But the chief thing they were worried about, and when we learn about checks and balances in 4th grade, what we are learning about, the check and balance was against the prospect of an overreaching executive. James Madison knew it would happen. He knew it would happen. And so that explains so much of our Constitution. You make the legislative branch Article 1, not the executive. You make the legislative branch Article 1, and you give that legislative branch some really key powers. Treaty ratification, confirmation of executive appointees, the power of the purse, the power to declare war. Nobody gives that to the legislature. That is an executive power anywhere else in the world, but no, we're going to put that as a legislative power. Do that in Article 1. Article 3, we're so used to this, we don't think about it. They gave judges life tenure. Nobody does that. Life tenure for judges? States don't do that, mostly. They weren't doing it in 1787. Why'd they give judges life tenure? So that a judge could stand up and say that executive order or that statute is unconstitutional without risk of being fired. Article 4, states. They gave states and governors all kinds of power. Specifically to them, anything not specifically for the feds were reserved to states. That was sort of carrying forward the Articles of Confederation attitude, but they gave a lot of power to states. When they added the amendments, powers to individuals, powers to vote, which have expanded dramatically over time. Certainly powers to run for office are implied in the Constitution because there's all kinds of rules about run for office. You have to be this age or that age. But the most important powers are powers that, I should mention before I get to individual powers, power of the press. First Amendment was not just to protect the press, it was to allow the press to check the executive, to hold leaders accountable by doing research and writing and then protecting their ability to do it. But the most important are the ones they handed to individuals. And I mentioned voting and running, but it doesn't stop there. The right to peacefully assemble, the right to petition your government for redress of grievances, the right to worship or not as you please without preference or punishment, the right to bear arms. These were individual rights that were given to people. In addition to voting and running for office, you need to have these powers because combined, what we give to Congress, what we give to judges, what we give to governors, what we give to the press, what we give to individuals, we hope that will be sufficient. We hope it will be sufficient to guard against the tendency of an executive toward despotism. So the Constitution at 230, we're living through the stress test of the constitutional model right now. We're living through exactly what the framers thought that they would see. And actually, this is not the first president that some have wondered if he's too much of an overreacher, too much of a little bit power mad. I mean, this is a president who trashes Congress, who trashes the courts, who trashes the press, who raises questions about things like religious tolerance and liberty, and even raises questions about basic notions of equality that were central to the Declaration of Independence, and once the 14th Amendment were added, has become central to the entire Constitution. And so we are living in this moment, and it's basically the stress test to see if the mechanisms that they put in place work 230 years later. And it was interesting, they were doing something pretty theoretical. They borrowed ideas from here and there, but the way they put it together, it wasn't like it had been tested. It was theoretical when they put it together. Well, now we're living through, and there have been other moments in our history, we're living through, do these mechanisms work? And I want to tell you, I think they're working pretty well, although I will say my critique and exception is about the Article 1 piece of the thing. So let me go through the mechanisms and tell you what I see and what makes me feel pretty optimistic that the Madisonian allocation of these powers to people is really working. Article 1, we're seeing some signs of life, but I'm going to come back to Article 1 and I'll give you the good, the bad, and the ugly there. Article 3, judges. Judges are standing up, like against the travel ban, standing up and saying, sorry, Mr. President, you can't do that. When the first judge or one of the first district judges ruled against the Muslim travel ban in February, the Attorney General said, and this is almost a direct quote, I can't believe that a judge on an island in the Pacific can tell the president what to do, as a district judge in Hawaii. I can't believe that a judge on an island in the Pacific can tell the president what to do. Take that complaint to James Madison. It was exactly what Madison wanted a trial judge to be able to do, and it's an indication of the workings of the system. How about the press? Press is doing some amazing work, looking at financial improprieties, looking at this question about Russian involvement in trying to attack the American election, looking at other stories. The press is really doing what Madison and others hoped they would do. Governors are saying, Mr. President, you can pull out of the Paris Climate Accord, but guess what? I'm keeping my state in anyway. Governors are doing what they were intended to do in that original setup. But the thing that is the most exciting is what citizens are doing. You can see the mechanisms coming to life in things like the Women's March, where the crowds were bigger than the inauguration. I see it in my office. I have Tyee Mallory here. Tyee, where are you sitting? Right here. Tyee runs my Richmond office, and Tyler Johnson right next to her. The calls and emails and letters to our office are just massive. They went up about 400% from my first 4 years in the Senate after Inauguration Day, and they've continued at a pretty intense pace, and it's calls and it's letters and it's emails and it's people going to town hall meetings and saying, hey, do this or this isn't acceptable. That's the petitioning the government for redress of grievances thing that's in the First Amendment. We're seeing that work. My favorite example of the workings of this sort of citizen civic muscle that Madison put into the Constitution were the protests at airports after the Muslim travel ban was announced, because those were spontaneous, because nobody knew when it was going to be announced. They didn't know when or if it was going to happen. So after the close of business on a Friday, this is when you want to do something that's kind of bad, that maybe you feel a little bit bad about, you wait till after 5 o'clock on Friday to do it, and that's what happened on January 29th. The White House puts out the executive order, and people all around the country went to airports spontaneously to protest. I was in Roanoke when it happened, and I read there were protesters at Dulles, and it just so happened I was flying into Dulles, and I thought, I want to go see these protesters. Because when you read about protesters, you get a picture in your mind eye, like, you know, what a protester will look like. So I go to Dulles, I land, I go to the international arrival gate the Monday after the order came out, and here were the protesters. It was people with signs like, Virginia is for lovers, we're not anti-Muslim. My favorite was there was a family with little kids and balloons. They had a big picture of Mr. Rogers, welcome to our neighborhood. They were turning out with, happy, smiling faces to welcome people to Virginia. That's James Madison. That's the right to peacefully assemble. I went back to the Senate that day. We always vote on Monday night, and I went back to tell my Senate colleagues, you won't believe what I just saw at Dulles. And a friend of mine, Joe Donnelly from Indiana, said, Tim, It was the same way at the Indianapolis airport, except we don't have international arrivals. We were hugging people from Columbus and Chicago and saying, welcome to the Hoosier State. We don't hate you. The spontaneity of people just saying, I don't like that. I should go to the airport. I hear there's something at the airport. I want to go out there. It was so powerful. So we're seeing the civic institutions that were put in place really come to life in an amazing way. So the stress is a president that's overreaching, but that was completely predicted and has been the case at a number of times in our history. The resilience is the mechanisms that were put in place by Madison and others are showing life. Now, I can't sugarcoat it. I can't say that the mechanisms are sufficient to stop everything bad from happening. I can't say that to Penelope. She lives in Charlottesville. She saw white supremacists come in and chant anti-Semitic statements from Nazi-era Germany as they marched through town. She saw them kill a beautiful paralegal, cause the deaths of 2 state troopers that I knew. They feel emboldened to do things that they weren't emboldened to do even a year ago. So I can't say the mechanisms are sufficient to stop all bad things from happening. She wrote me about dreamers, really. I can't even say to her, well, what I can say is I'll do everything I can to protect dreamers. And I actually think Congress will find a solution to the issue of dreamers, but I can't guarantee that we will. There have been losses, and I think there are going to be more. But I think I can say that the muscle that Madison and others put into this, the checks against this overreaching executive, are showing great life. And I feel a confidence that the end of the chapter is going to be, in this country, it's still the case that the institutions and the collective spirit of people are stronger than any of the individuals, be they president, senate, or anybody else. I had an experience that was a pivotal one in my life earlier. I lived in a military dictatorship in Honduras in 1983 and 84. I'm sorry, in 1980 and 81. And that was an eye-opener. Many things about living in Honduras, a very poor country, were an eye-opener, but living in a place where the rules and institutions meant nothing, and the generals at the top could basically change whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, and realizing that the people had absolutely no barrier, no protection between just the general saying this is the way it's going to be, throwing you in jail, no trial, who cares, executing you, who cares. They had no protections of the kind that we have. It really makes me appreciate the kinds of protections we have if we use them. If we use them. Superpowers are only superpowers if you use them. One of my staffers said, remember, it would have just been a quirky kid in a neighborhood in Brooklyn who thought he had spidey senses. If he didn't use them, he just would have been a quirky kid named Peter. But when he fights Dr. Octopus, he becomes Spider-Man, right? So you are spider reference there that I thought I'd throw in. So I am generally feeling that this is a predictable moment. Many things are unpredictable. It's kind of a predictable moment in what the framers thought of and were worried about. And I think the mechanisms they've put in place are showing great life after 230 years. But now I'm going to be hard on my branch and tell you a little bit about challenges in Congress. Since I've been tough on the president, I think it's only fair that I now turn my attention to the Article 1 branch. And there's 3 tests that are out there for the Article 1 branch that are sort of TBD about whether we will rise to the occasion or not and do what an Article 1 branch is supposed to do. So, the Article 1 branch was really supposed to be first among equals, but my argument is, having been there now for about 5 years and kind of trying to grapple with and put my finger on, like, what? When you were a kid and you were in elementary school and you had a math teacher, I don't know if any of you, did you have a math teacher that taught you the acronym TWEETZOIP? Anybody remember that one? Was it only nuns like Sister Perpetua who would use that? TWEETZOIP was the whole is equal to the sum of its parts. So I learned that in 2nd or 3rd grade in math. And it's mathematically a truism, but life, the whole can be more than the sum of the parts, or the whole can be less than the sum of the parts. And so often now, I think in Congress it's equal to less than the sum of the parts. The parts are pretty amazing. I have 99 colleagues. And I tell you, Everyone is there for a reason because they're accomplished. Sometimes they're accomplished because they're brilliant. Sometimes they're accomplished because they work so hard. Sometimes they're accomplished because, man, that person really has street smarts. There's just a time in the Senate when you're working with people, and it may take you a while to see this, but you suddenly see it and think, yeah, I can see why that person's here. I can see why that person's here. And I've had that feeling about every colleague I have. I can see why that person's here. It's hard to get to the Senate. They're there for a reason. But our whole is equal to less than the sum of the parts. We do and cooperate on a lot more than you think. I got a really good early hearing screening bill passed with Senator Portman 2 weeks ago that the president signed. It's a really good bill. It gets no attention because cooperation is not newsworthy. Conflict is. So that's a little frustrating sometimes. But even as I say we do more than you might think, I have to acknowledge we do a lot less than we should, and especially on tough issues. And over time, I think what's happened in Congress is I try to analyze it from a system standpoint to figure out how I can not only get the bills passed I want to get passed, and I have a pretty good track record of getting bills passed, but I don't like the way the place is working. I think it can work a lot better. Is I basically have concluded that Congress, now under many presidents, and frankly under Democratic and Republican numbers, has kind of devolved into an Article 2.5 branch instead of an Article 1 branch. We react to the president. We reacted to President Obama. We're reacting to President Trump. And I'm sure it was the case before. Congress was not just supposed to be a reactor. Congress was really put to be an Article 1 branch, not just to be a reactor. In fact, a lot of legislation, powerful legislation over the years, really started in Congress. It wasn't a president pushing a tax reform plan. It started in Congress. And I have people here who are better historians of this than me. We've got some great law professors and folks here who really study this. But when was the last time that Congress really did something big and meaningful that wasn't pushed by a president? That wasn't primarily an executive initiative? As I racked my brain about it, the Americans with Disabilities Act was a really great civil rights act, and it really was pushed by Congress. Bob Dole played a critical role in it. The first President Bush was a strong supporter, but I would argue, and I think I'm right, that that was really a congressional initiative, not a reaction to the president. But you don't see Congress doing a lot of legislation that is not driven by the president. We've been spending months about the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act, when it was passed, was an initiative of President Obama, and the attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act was President Trump said, we're going to do it on day one. Now we're doing tax reform. The president is out there pushing it. We react to presidents is sort of what we do. And there's a lot of things that only Congress is supposed to do, like write budgets, that we don't really do. Congress is supposed to declare war. We don't really do it. And so we've sort of devolved back into an Article 2.5 branch. And I think what we need to do is get back to being an Article 1 branch again and claim with some pride, but then own the responsibility of it, getting back to sort of being the first among equals. And I'll just tell you, as I conclude, there's 3 interesting tests that are on the table right now that are tests of the Article 1 branch. I do see some signs that Congress, and especially the Senate, is starting to kind of realize, gosh, this is a kind of a challenging time. We have to up our game a little bit. I see some signs of this. I'm not sure how much it will flower, but I see some signs of some more green shoots coming up in this. But there's 3 issues on the table right now. One statutory, but that's sort of a test of the body. One constitutional, and one constitutional crisis potential. Statutory. A test of Congress, a test of the Senate. There's no issue that's more important in anybody's life than their health. There's no expenditure that any person ever makes out of their own pocketbook that's more important than spending on the health of yourself or your family. There's no sector of the American economy that is bigger than health and health care. And yet, by this measure, Congress has really been bad about it. Health and health care has been purely partisan. We haven't done anything really meaningful and bipartisan since the Affordable Care Act passed, and that was in 2010. So now we're 7 years later, and on the most important issue to people, that is the most important expenditure that they ever make, and that is the biggest sector of the United States economy, Congress has been unwilling to do anything that's really bipartisan in health. To the contrary, when the Affordable Care Act was passed, there was an open process that included a lot of input from Republicans, but it was voted on, it was purely partisan. Amendments, 150 amendments in the Senate were accepted by Republican senators. 150 of their amendments were accepted, but when it got to the vote, it was purely a partisan vote. And it has been pretty much purely partisan until now. This is a pretty important issue to people. It shouldn't be partisan because health isn't partisan. Health is an everybody issue. Well, I was added to the Health Committee in the Senate in January. My consolation prize for coming back and being on a national ticket was, you always wanted to be on the Health and Education Committee. I have great committees, Armed Services, Foreign Relations, Budget, but what do I know? I've been a mayor and governor. I know health and education. I always wanted to be on that committee, and they said, you have a higher profile now, we'll put you on the committee. And we have been engaged in a battle about health care because Republicans, and I have a very close relationship with my Republican chair, Lamar Alexander of Tennessee. He kind of read me the facts of life. I said, okay, now I'm on the committee. Can't we start working on bipartisan solutions? Tim, let me tell you something. The Republicans have promised to repeal. You're going to have to let this thing play out because we're going to have a vote on repeal. Maybe it'll win or maybe it won't, but you're going to have to wait until that's done. And then if it is not repealed, then the door will open for bipartisan solutions. So all from January into the spring and into the summer in the Senate, a super dramatic vote at 2 in the morning in July where John McCain came back from being diagnosed with a brain tumor out of a hospital. This was funny, my colleagues were saying he's going to vote with the Republicans. They got the vote to kill the Affordable Care Act. John McCain's my chairman on Armed Services. And I said to them, listen, I tell you, John McCain is not going to get a brain tumor diagnosis and come back and vote to take health insurance away from 25 million people. I'll tell you, he's not going to do it. And they said, but Tim, he's voting with them on all the procedural votes. I said, I give you that. Tim, they brought the vice president in to break a tie. You don't bring the vice president to break a tie when there's no tie to be broken. Listen, I get you. The Las Vegas odds says you're right and I'm wrong, but I'm telling you I'm right. I'm telling you, John McCain is not voting to take health insurance away from 25 million people. Well, when he voted with us, the repeal effort sort of stalled, and at that moment, we started to work in earnest to come up with a bipartisan fix improvement to the Affordable Care Act. We announced the deal about 2 weeks ago, 25 sponsors, 12 Dems, 12 Rs, 1 independent. It will be the first bipartisan thing we will have done in this contentious area since 2010, really before 2010. The bill is out there in the Senate now. It's been announced. We have enough votes to pass it. I bet we have 75 votes for this. What we don't have is a commitment from the leader to allow it to be voted on, because the president is going hot and cold on it. Again, are we reacting to the president, or are we doing our Article I job in fixing a problem? The president said he liked it. He said he didn't like it. He's going back and forth. And I get where Leader McConnell is. He's got a job to do too. He's kind of saying, well, if I put my people out on this and the president trashes it, what will happen to them? But this will be a really important test, because when it's bipartisan, we have more than 100 healthcare groups out supporting it, from patients groups, the American Cancer Society, hospitals. It's bipartisan. We have enough votes to pass it by an overwhelming majority. The healthcare stakeholders say it will be helpful. The CBO came out with a score last week. It said it will reduce the deficit. It will reduce people's premiums. What's not to like about this? So this is going to be a really important test of whether Congress will act like an Article I branch or whether we'll just react to the president. And that one will get resolved in the course of the next 6 weeks. The next one is constitutional. The hearing that I'm going up to today at 5 o'clock is a hearing with Secretaries Mattis and Tillerson about Congress's refusal to declare war. After 9/11, Congress passed a 60-word war authorization on the 14th of September, 2001, that said we would go after the perpetrators of the 9/11 attack. The perpetrators were Al-Qaeda. Everybody knew Al-Qaeda is in the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. We would go after the perpetrators. That led to the war in Afghanistan that's still going on. But more than that, it has led to now 16 years of war. I was visiting with some folks earlier who are veterans of this era. 16 years of war, not just against Al-Qaeda, but also against the Taliban, also against ISIS. The authorization said we'd go after the perpetrators of the 9/11 attack. ISIS didn't start till 2 years after 9/11. We are using this authorization against splinter groups in Niger that didn't start till 2016, 15 years after 9/11. We're using the authorization in more than a dozen countries. We've triggered it for use on nearly 40 occasions. And when I came to the Senate, I was like, are you kidding? This is the most jealous power that Congress should guard, the power to declare war. What, we're going to let a president just do that, carte blanche? As a Senate candidate, I criticized my friend President Obama for bombing in Libya, not because the rationale was bad. The rationale was good, but he didn't bring it to Congress. When President Obama decided that we needed to go on offense against ISIS in August of 2014, I criticized him, not because ISIS were good guys. We needed to take action against it, but he didn't insist on a congressional vote. And as much as I criticized President Obama, I've criticized Congress even more. My Foreign Relations Committee chair, Bob Corker, who's a friend, gets so mad at me every time I bring up that Congress doesn't have the backbone to do this. But Jeff Flake, a Republican, and I have an authorization bill in that we've worked on this together for 2.5 years. We redrafted it and came up with some better ideas that we put in about 6 months ago, and we're having a hearing this afternoon with the Secretaries of Defense and State to talk about the need for a new war authorization after 16 years. I wish I could say I'm being persuasive. It's not me that's being persuasive. It's news stories about the death of 4 Green Berets in Niger. Niger? People read those articles, Niger, wait, I thought it was Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. Niger? New York Times this morning, investigation into the potential strangling of a Green Beret by 2 Navy SEALs on a special operation in Mali. Mali? I have a document that is an unclassified document that I'm going to introduce at the hearing today that is going to show the number of countries in Africa where the U.S. is assuming that there will be high-risk military engagements, and the number of countries on this document I'm going to introduce is really going to surprise people. It's really going to surprise people. So it's the circumstance as well as concerns about the president's mercurial judgment that has made the committee decide, finally, well, guys, I guess we should take this up. So at least we're paying attention to it, but this is a test of constitutional magnitude for Congress. Will Congress finally engage on this, or will we continue to abdicate this power to the executive and just say, look, you do it, and if it works bad, we'll criticize you, but at least we don't have to vote and own it ourselves. This infuriates me. In fact, I get goosebumps when I talk about it because I get so mad. How can you deploy people into harm's way and have them risk their lives and be killed or injured, but then say, but yeah, I don't want to vote on it? Man, that could be politically harmful. If I cast a war vote, it'll be controversial. Even if it's very justified, there's going to be negative consequences, and you might get the vote wrong, and so members of Congress don't even want to have the vote. We want to just criticize the president for whether we like or don't like what the president is doing, but we're making people risk their lives and be killed. Could there be anything more publicly immoral than ordering people into combat in a system that says Congress is supposed to vote, but trying to take the attitude that I don't want to put my fingerprints on it? I told you about Madison. Madison put this whole check and balance thing about the Constitution into a letter that he wrote to Thomas Jefferson 10 years after 1787. And it was a letter that he wrote to Jefferson as Jefferson was grappling with war powers questions. We think there's new things like non-state terrorist organizations, the Barbary Coast Pirates. They were sort of a quasi-state, non-state North African terrorist organization. Jefferson was grappling with this question. As the commander-in-chief, if the Barbary Coast Pirates attack ships, I can always tell them just repel the attacks. Sink the pirates that are attacking you. The commander-in-chief always has the ability to defend against an imminent attack without asking permission. That's what one of the powers that commander-in-chief is. But Jefferson wrote to Madison and said, what if I want to do more than just repel an attack? What if I just want to go to where they are and destroy all their ships so they can't attack me anymore? And Madison said, well, that's going on offense, and you need Congress for that. If you go on offense, and it's not just imminent defense, you need Congress. You got to have a vote of Congress. And he described it this way. Listen to what Madison said about the executive. And it's about war powers, but it's just more generally about what the document is designed to do. He said, our Constitution supposes what the history of all governments demonstrates, that it is the executive most interested in war and thus most prone to it. For this reason, we have, with studied care, vested the power of war-making with the legislature. Madison was trying to change the whole course of human history with respect to war-making by having the declaration be done by the people's elective legislative body, and then you couldn't have 535 commanders-in-chief, so once declared, you got to hand over the management of the mission to the one commander-in-chief. He viewed it as a check against a well-known executive example of overreaching power starting wars when you shouldn't. So the second test that we will grapple with in the aftermath of the horrible news about the death of these soldiers in Niger that surprised many people is whether Congress will own up to that constitutional power. And the third one, which I can't say too much about because I don't know where it's going, is there were indictments today. We have a special prosecutor looking into whether an American election was compromised. Not compromised in the sense of the outcome, but compromised in the sense of was the integrity of the election attacked. Why do I say that? It doesn't make a difference whether it affected the outcome. We have had two presidents who were impeached, but ultimately the House with Presidents Johnson, Andrew Johnson, and Clinton put the indictment on the table, but they were not impeached, ultimately convicted in the Senate. President Nixon is the only example of somebody. Now, he wasn't fully impeached, but it was clear that he would be, and for that reason he resigned. What was Nixon's offense? It began with the break-in of the Democratic National Committee before the 1972 presidential election to potentially destabilize the election. The election was a landslide. Nixon won 63-37 in the election. So the break-in at the DNC had nothing to do with the outcome of the election, but Congress said, we care enough about the integrity of our process that we have to get to the bottom of it. And then there was obstruction of justice and hiding evidence, and it all mushroomed, and President Nixon resigned. So what Director Mueller is doing in some ways is eerily similar to the Watergate situation, because it's about the integrity of an election, whether or not it affected the outcome, about the integrity of an election. There are two differences, at least two differences, and they cut each way. Nixon's activities occurred when he was a sitting president. That makes the Nixon example maybe more serious than actions taken by somebody running to be president. But this example involves not low-level flunkies breaking into the DNC. The indictment today is against the chairman of the campaign, and the question is whether the chairman conspired with a foreign adversary. The head of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joe Dunford, says Russia is the principal state adversary of the United States right now. My oldest son, who's a Marine infantry commander, was deployed during the entire 2016 campaign on the border with Russia, training the militaries of our allies on that border to protect themselves against the United States chief state adversary. He was deployed there with his entire 1,200-member Marine battalion. So the presence of the foreign adversary and the elevated level of the campaign chair compared to the flunkies that broke into the DNC makes this in some ways more serious. We don't know where it's going to go. We don't know whether it's going to lead nowhere. We don't know whether it's going to lead somewhere. We don't know whether the special prosecutor might get fired before we get to the bottom of it. And so there's a whole series of issues that are sort of out there that could even be at the level of a constitutional crisis that only Congress can resolve. The first two tests we have to grapple with, I sort of hope we don't have to grapple with the third test. We will either do something good or not do something good on this statutory health care issue and show whether we can do something bipartisan health. We will either do something good or not do something good on taking the war powers issue seriously. Who knows where the Mueller investigation and the Senate Intel investigation will? We don't know. But if it breaks that there was some level of cooperation, for example, between the campaign and a foreign adversary, it will pose very existential questions about Congress, and is Congress up to the responsibility of carrying out its duties? So it's a pretty important time right now. But I'll just close where I started, and then I'd love to open it up and take questions or take your advice. while it's a challenging and existential time, I do think Madison and the colleagues, look, the Constitution can't be put on a pedestal. It had slavery in it. You know, it didn't, even though the Declaration of Independence mentioned equality, the Constitution 11 years later didn't. Pretty amazing. Civil War had to be fought, and then the equality provisions had to be put back in the Constitution with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So you can't claim more for it in 1787 than you should. However, they did predict the moment we're living through. And they did put checks in place to deal with the moment we're living through. And in most instances, the checks are showing great life, vitality, and resilience. And the one that's got the question mark about it is the Article I branch. And so I definitely, the Catholic in me feels as, you know, like, go to the broken place, you know, the Catholic guilt complex, go to the broken place and try to make it better. Hey, thanks for having me today, and I'd love to open it up, and I want to be on your time. If I can take a question or two, I would be really happy to. I'm going to come first row, then last row, then I'll go over to the other side of the room. So right here. And I think a mic is coming.
A mic. Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Senator Kaine, for
Absolutely.
coming. So I have a question that deals with your third part of your test and into your second part of your test.
Yep.
Technology is really kind of at the heart of both of those pieces as we move into the 21st century, and yet the laws don't really reflect how technology works and cross borders and globalization. How is Congress going to not be reactionary and be proactive in kind of putting technology into the correct place that it should be, and not allow, Cyber Command is finally going to break apart from NSA, and I'm a veteran, I did intelligence and cryptology, that's where I come from. So how is Congress going to be proactive in making sure that we don't just give Cyber Command kind of carte blanche to go offensively in reaction to our third test.
And tell me your name.
I'm John Forden.
John.
I'm a 2L here.
John. So John, great question, and you're right. So the technology questions are pretty heavy in the war declaration, because war, you know, it's not just a platoon marching across the field, or, you know, it's, when is a cyber attack an act of war? We don't know the answer to that question. When would a cyber attack trigger the collective defense obligation of Article 5 of the NATO Charter? We haven't completely answered that question. We have the best technologists and some of the best institutions in the world. Where we're short is on the doctrine side. The technology is raced ahead of the doctrine, which so often happens. And we have to think and put the rules in place without, like, overreacting in ways that would choke off technology and hence choke off innovation that technology brings to the economy. My colleague Mark Warner is a real technology expert and is grappling with, you know, fake news and social media, and can you control to some degree the content and put obligations on social media platforms to try to, you know, at least block some kinds of mischief. So I mean, I don't have a great answer for the question, but I will say this: we are spending more and more time on it. I'm a little bit frustrated because we started to hit on the Obama administration really in 2014, 2015. Where's the doctrines about cyber? And we ended up without doctrines about cyber, and we suffered a cyber attack of our election, and we're sort of lackadaisical about it. We have to have a deterrence doctrine, and you have no deterrence doctrine if you don't tell people what you would do and then respond in a very dramatic and public way when they do something. Attribution questions are hard in some cyber attacks, and you don't want to respond against the wrong person. But the U.S. has been subject to attacks because we don't really have a deterrence doctrine. And then on matters of war, like, you know, does a drone strike need a declaration of war? Do you only need a declaration of war when it's a person? You know, we're going to increasingly be in a world of unmanned aircraft, unmanned subs, all kinds of other activities. What is war anymore? It was an easier call maybe for Madison than it is today. So raising a very good point. I think I had a question in the back row. Yeah, there.
Thank you, Senator, for taking the time to speak to us today.
Absolutely.
My question is also related to technology, but more focused on privacy. How do you think the judiciary and the congressional branch will focus on the right to privacy and how it will evolve in our digital age, since as more and more people grow up without living in a life without internet or Facebook or Twitter and so on?
Very good question. My colleague Mark, who is on the Intel committee, has had an idea out on the table for about a year. We really need like a stakeholder group of technology whizzes and privacy advocates to sit down and help us grapple and propose legislation in this technology space. And usually when you hear somebody proposing a commission, it's like, oh, come on, just do something. The commission is kind of a dodge. In this case, having a commission to help us grapple with these balancing issues is really important, and I'll tell you why. You should not really trust Congress to strike the balance right between security and privacy, because everybody in Congress has given up any expectation of privacy so long ago we've forgotten what it is to have one. I mean, I have no privacy, and I've known that for years. And so I've sort of forgotten what it's like to be a regular person and to have a legitimate expectation of privacy. And so if you were going to ask me, okay, well then you strike the balance between privacy and security, I'm going to come down on the security side, because I'm not a regular person with an expectation of privacy. And I think it's extremely hard to be in Congress and fairly analyze what people's expectations of privacy should be, because we've all given it up. And whether we consciously are aware of it or just subconsciously, it pushes us over. And obviously we want to avoid bad security things happening to us. So we understand that rationale, but we don't really understand what it is to just be a regular person with a reasonable expectation of privacy. So if we could pull together stakeholder groups, and this is what Senator Warner has proposed, that would grapple with some of these balancing questions, I think it would really help us. You know, we've gone down the path in some technology-related areas, whether it's, Pfizer, the Patriot Act, or whatever, but we haven't had that kind of a stakeholder group with, military and intel experts, technology experts, and privacy advocates really together around the table to help us strike the balance right, and that's what we need. Did I have any hands on this side? I'll just maybe take one here. Yeah, please, right here.
And I'm afraid we have time just for one last question
Great.
here.
Okay, hi. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
I just wanted to borrow a little bit more of your optimism here that you brought today. So my question is, looking at it from more of a pessimistic point of view, a lot of responsibility is put on the people in what you've been talking about in terms of staying aware and keeping up with news and like knowing what's going on.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the fact that in a way we're moving toward a post-truth era, in the sense where people can take in information and just see what fits them? And like, I kind of want to hear how you think that that's going to play out in terms of like being aware and still sticking up and defending ourselves and our rights.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question. And it ties into sort of some of the technology issues too. We can so easily intentionally self-segregate into like political affinity groups, and without us even trying to, search engines and others that kind of know who we're looking at start to target certain stories to us to feed our inclinations and not give us other stories. If you and I each, go on a search engine like Google and we want to understand something about the U.S.-Turkey relationship, you'll get a whole different series of articles than I will. And you can say that about virtually all the topics. So there is not just a post-truth, but sort of a narrowing of focus, even if it's not a matter of believing lies. If you just get a narrow perspective and we all just stick in our own little perspectives, it makes things tougher. I really think it does. The interesting thing, though, is there's also, raise your hand if you use Wikipedia, right? So isn't it interesting how, the internet technology, which is often driving segregation and very narrow points of view, also has something like Wikipedia, which is a really endearing, touching, and valuable effort, and probably quixotic, but at least the effort is important, to try to come up with something objective. The idea is the wiki platform is to try to come up with something objective. If you put something on that's wrong, you're going to have a citation needed, you're going to be drummed off. Jefferson had a beautiful phrase that was in his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, that a paraphrase of it is in the Virginia Constitution, and it says, "Progress in government and all else depends upon the broadest possible diffusion of knowledge among the general population." Now, he wouldn't have imagined all knowledge being digitized and all knowledge being, at your fingertips if you have a search engine. He wouldn't have imagined that, but it was sort of what he was talking about. But yeah, how do we grapple with just listening to the point of view I want to listen to? Simon and Garfunkel, man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. This is a human tendency that we can all suffer from. And I don't really know, but I don't have the great answer to this, except I think people do kind of get tired of a low-cal or no-cal diet, you know? And I think you kind of embrace the angry extreme, but then I think there's a tendency then to kind of want to come back and want something a little more nourishing and more satisfying. Not for everybody, but just to use an example, and again, I've been hard on the president, I've been hard on Congress in my speech, I'm just going to use an example about President Trump. He got 46% of the vote. Why is his popularity 9 months in 38? It's because people are seeing things, I'm not so sure, you know, I actually support him. Now I'm not so sure what I think. They're watching, they're paying attention, they're seeing him play around with the truth and say, there were millions of votes were fraudulent in Virginia, you know, which he has said, or that the inauguration crowd was so massive, you know, which it wasn't bigger than the open, and they're watching that, and so what's the difference between 46% on election day and 38% now? It's people are having a reaction to that. Now, if I would make a prediction to you, this won't make you happy. I don't think that number will go below 30. I think that number will be 30 regardless of what happens. Even if Mueller comes out with 500 indictments, you know, it may go to 28, but there's going to be a core there. But there is a persuadable group of people who are always of sufficient size to dictate the outcome of any election or most policy debates. There's a persuadable group of people who I think, you know, might go down the path of accepting the untruth, but it's a low-cal or no-cal diet, and I think you start to go back and want something more nourishing. I'll give you another example that's kind of connected. We got cyber hacked in the election. President Obama said we're getting cyber hacked by the Russians, but people are like, they didn't worry that much about it. The Russians were engaged in similar activity with Brexit. If you really want to read a scary story, Google November 2016 Macedonian elections. There were elections in Macedonia happening at the same time as the U.S. And read the stories about Russia, what Russia did in those elections. It is just absolutely unbelievable. Well, we succumbed to it. There were news stories about it at the time, but people weren't that worried. Well, by the time the French elections were happening in 2017, there had been enough examples, Estonia in 2007, and Brexit, and the U.S., and Macedonia. By the time it's happening in France, the government is warning people, hey, they're hacking into databases, the Russians are trying to influence our election. And then now they're dumping stuff out through the version of WikiLeaks or whatever, they're trying to influence the election. The French electorate was skeptical. They had seen the effects in other places, and they had seen what it did, and they ended up having a skepticism about some of the stuff they were hearing because they realized, this is kind of bogus. We got to be a little more wary. So people's natural instincts of suspicion once raised, of concern once raised, allowed them to be a little more discerning. That's another kind of antidote to the complete anti-truth. Once you've been fooled a couple of times, people start, not so sure I want to go down that path. So I think it's not just involvement, but it's also a wariness or a skepticism starts to give people an appropriate way to guard against some of the worst of this. Hey, great questions. Thanks for having me today.
You're invited to pick up a box lunch as you exit the Moot courtroom. Thank you for coming.